The wind swept gently across the harbor of Lunenburg, a fishing town in Nova Scotia, where the houses clung to the hillside in neat rows of bright colors. The air carried the scent of salt and timber, a reminder of the old shipyards that had once made the town proud. On a narrow lane near the water lived Margaret McLeod, a widow in her late 40s, with her teenage daughter, Evelyn. Margaret was known for her determination. She worked as a seamstress, stitching uniforms for the local school and mending coats torn by the endless Canadian winters. Yet behind her resolute smile lay a habit that troubled her daughter deeply. Margaret refused to accept help from anyone. Even when the snow piled high against their door or when the roof leaked after a storm, she would wave away the offers of neighbors and insist she could manage alone. Evelyn admired her mother's strength, but she also saw the cost. Nights spent mending by candlelight left Margaret's hands raw and trembling. Days without proper rest carved shadows under her eyes. Evelyn wanted to help, but her mother's pride became an invisible wall between them. One evening, as the winter sun sank behind the frozen bay, Evelyn watched her mother patching yet another tear in a fisherman's coat. The oil lamp flickered, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. Evelyn thought of her schoolmates, whose families gathered around warm stoves, laughing together. She wished her mother would allow them a moment of ease, just once. But Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the fabric, her jaw tight. For her, survival meant standing tall even when the ground beneath her threatened to give way. What neither mother nor daughter knew was that this unyielding pride would soon be tested, and the storm ahead would shake the very foundation of their lives. The first signs of trouble came with the shifting skies. By late January, dark clouds rolled in from the Atlantic, pressing down upon the town like a heavy hand. Fishermen at the harbor hurried to secure their boats, and shopkeepers nailed wooden boards across their windows. The radio crackled with warnings of one of the fiercest blizzards in years. Inside the McLeod home, Evelyn stood by the frosted window, her breath misting the glass. She had heard her classmates talking about families preparing together, stocking cupboards, and arranging places by the fire. But when she suggested to her mother that they might seek help from neighbors, Margaret's eyes hardened. "We need no one, Evelyn," she said, her voice as firm as the wooden floor beneath their feet. "We'll face it as we always have." Evelyn said nothing, but her stomach tightened. She watched as Margaret struggled to patch the roof with old tar paper before the storm broke. The ladder shook in the biting wind, yet her mother refused to let anyone steady it for her. Pride, sharper than the cold itself, drove her every action. That night, the storm arrived. Snow whipped through the streets like shards of glass, rattling shutters and burying the town beneath a blinding white curtain. The old timbers of their house groaned under the weight of ice, and the roof leaked in thin, steady drops that spattered into a bucket. Evelyn lay awake, clutching her blanket, listening to the roar of the storm and the relentless coughing of her exhausted mother. In the early hours, a crash split the darkness. A section of the roof had given way, scattering plaster and snow across the kitchen floor. Evelyn rushed to help, but Margaret pushed her aside, determined to mend the damage herself with nothing more than nails and stubbornness. For the first time, Evelyn felt fear not only for the storm outside, but for the storm that lived within her mother. She wondered how long they could endure both before something broke that could never be mended. The morning after the blizzard, the town emerged like a battlefield buried in white. Smoke rose weakly from chimneys, and men with shovels carved paths through the heavy drifts. In the McLeod house, silence hung thick. Evelyn swept snow from the kitchen floor while Margaret hammered planks over the broken section of roof. Her hands were cut and blistered, her breath ragged in the frigid air. Evelyn reached for the hammer. "Let me," she said softly. But Margaret snatched it back. "No. You'll only slow me down." The words stung more sharply than the cold. Evelyn turned away, hiding her tears, though she could not hide the bitterness rising in her chest. She wanted to shout, to tell her mother that her pride was tearing them apart. Yet the words lodged in her throat, frozen like the icicles that hung from the eaves. That evening, neighbors came to check on them. "Mr. Fraser, a retired carpenter, offered to repair the roof properly. Margaret thanked him, but refused. She closed the door with a smile that concealed her exhaustion, then collapsed into a chair, clutching her chest as if the weight of the world pressed upon her. Evelyn watched in silence, knowing her mother's refusal had cost them yet another chance at relief. School resumed days later, though many children stayed home to help their families recover. Evelyn sat at her desk, her thoughts far from the lessons on the blackboard. She thought of Mr. Fraser's kind face and how her mother's stubbornness had turned him away. At lunch, a classmate named Thomas approached her. "My father said your roof's still broken. He could help if you'd like." Evelyn forced a smile. "Thank you, but my mother won't allow it." The boy frowned. "Then she's being foolish." The words echoed in her mind as she walked home through snowdrifts. Foolish. It was what Evelyn had always feared to admit. She wanted to believe her mother's strength was a shield, not a weakness. Yet every day the cracks grew wider, not only in the roof above them, but in the bond between them. That night, Evelyn lay awake listening to the wind rattle the patched boards. She whispered into the dark, "Why must you fight everyone, Mama? Even me?" But the silence answered her back, heavy and unyielding. Weeks passed, and the winter deepened. One afternoon, as Evelyn walked home from school, she saw Mr. Fraser standing by their gate. His coat was dusted with snow, and in his arms he carried a bundle of new timber. "I know your mother won't ask," he said gently, "but a roof should not wait. May I?" Evelyn hesitated. She longed to say yes, to end the nights of dripping water and shivering cold. Yet Margaret's voice rang in her mind, stern and absolute. "We need no one." She lowered her eyes. I cannot say yes without her." Mr. Fraser sighed, resting the timber against the fence. "Then promise me this. If she falters, you'll not bear the burden alone."
"Come to me."
Evelyn nodded, though guilt gnawed at her. She felt caught between loyalty to her mother and the desperate yearning for help. As she entered the house, she saw Margaret bent over her sewing table, coughing into her sleeve. The room smelled of damp and sickness. Evelyn realized with a chill that her mother was fighting more than pride. She was fighting time itself. Margaret's cough worsened as February dragged on. She worked through the pain, her needle darting through fabric though her hands trembled. Evelyn begged her to rest, but Margaret dismissed her with a weak smile. "I've endured worse," she whispered, though her voice cracked like ice on the harbor. Evelyn watched helplessly as her mother grew thinner. She carried buckets of water, chopped wood, and tried to take on the sewing herself, though her stitches were uneven. Margaret scolded her gently, then pushed herself back to work, as if sheer will could mend both cloth and flesh. At night, Evelyn listened to the rasp of her mother's breathing. She felt anger and sorrow entwined, a knot too tight to untangle. She wanted to scream, to shake her mother until she understood that strength was not the same as silence. But instead, Evelyn sat in the dim light, holding her mother's hand as if that small act might keep her from slipping further away. One evening, Margaret collapsed. The sound of her body hitting the floor sent Evelyn running from her room. She found her mother pale and gasping, the needle fallen from her grasp. Panic surged through her as she knelt beside her. "Please, Mama, let me fetch help." Margaret shook her head weakly. "No, I'll be fine." But Evelyn no longer listened. She ran into the night, her boots crunching through the snow until she reached Mr. Fraser's cottage. Tears froze on her cheeks as she pounded on the door. Within minutes, Mr. Fraser and his son Thomas carried Margaret to the firelit warmth of their home. A doctor was summoned, who declared Margaret exhausted, malnourished, and dangerously ill from untreated pneumonia. Evelyn sat by the bed, her hands trembling as she realized how close she had come to losing her. For the first time, Margaret did not protest. She lay still, too weak to raise her wall of pride. The armor had cracked, and Evelyn glimpsed the fragile truth beneath. In the days that followed, neighbors rallied around. They repaired the McLeod roof, stocked the cupboards, and carried firewood to the hearth. Evelyn felt both relief and shame. Relief that the burden was no longer hers alone. Shame that it had taken her mother's collapse to make this possible. Margaret, propped up in bed, watched silently as others worked. Her eyes betrayed a struggle Evelyn could not name, a battle between gratitude and humiliation. One evening, as Evelyn brought her tea, Margaret spoke at last. "I thought strength meant standing alone. I see now it can also mean allowing others in." Her voice broke, and Evelyn felt tears burn her eyes. It was not a full surrender, but it was the closest her mother had ever come to admitting her own weakness. And for Evelyn it was enough. As March arrived, the snow began to melt. Streams of water trickled through the streets, carrying with them the heaviness of winter. The McLeod house, though patched and scarred, stood firm once more. Evelyn returned to school, her heart lighter than it had been in months. At home, she read aloud to her mother by the fire, stories of distant places where pride did not weigh so heavily upon love. Margaret listened quietly, her hand resting on her daughter's. Yet even as the thaw spread across the land, Evelyn knew the true storm had not been the blizzard outside, but the struggle within her mother's heart. It was a storm that might never fully pass, but for the first time, sunlight pierced through the clouds. Spring arrived, painting Nova Scotia in soft greens and pale blossoms. Fishermen mended their nets, children played in the streets, and the harbor bustled once more with life. In the McLeod household, things had changed subtly but irrevocably. Margaret worked more slowly now, taking breaks to sip tea while neighbors visited. Evelyn noticed her mother's pride had not vanished, but it had softened, like ice melting into water. One evening, as the sun set over the harbor, Evelyn stood by the window. She thought of the winter behind them, the storm, the collapse, the night she had run for help. She knew she would carry the memory always, not as a wound, but as a lesson etched deep in her heart. Margaret joined her at the window, her face lined with both sorrow and strength. She said nothing, and neither did Evelyn. Yet in the quiet, an understanding passed between them, deeper than words. For Evelyn, it was clear now. Sometimes the greatest enemy is not the storm outside, but the walls we build within.